Hi there, APES students. Welcome to the APES Bootcamp review that'll help you get started on reviewing for your final exam, whether you're taking the official AP exam on May 18th or you're just taking the exam for the class. I know there's a document called How to FRQ on Schoology, and you're welcome to read through that. I also wanted to walk you through some of the reasoning behind some of those answer choices and recommendations on that document, as well as supplement you with some examples on how to construct a good response for your FRQs. Let's get started just looking at how this new exam for 2020 is going to be constructed. The exam date is May 18th for everyone taking the regular exam, and that's what you should be prepared to do. And your exam will be released at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. There are going to be 2 free response questions on it. The first one will be, you'll have 25 minutes to read and respond. You can either handwrite your response or type it, and then you'll have 5 minutes to upload it. That first question will be about designing an investigation, and we'll do some prep on how to answer that kind of an FRQ because you haven't done that this year yet. It'll be weighted at about 60% of the total grade, and in which that FRQ you'll analyze research study and describe environmental problems and how you would use a controlled research study to look at and evaluate what's going on. The second question will be analyzing an environmental problem and proposing a solution. That is going to be a shorter FRQ. It's only going to be about 40% of your grade, and you should spend 15 minutes on it, reading, responding, and then you'll have another 5 minutes to upload it. The exam questions will cover units 1 through 7. What won't be tested on it is climate change and global change, as well as some of the pollution. However, you don't have to worry. If you answer something that's climate change related, that will still count as a valid answer. And then there are going to be questions that are constructed such that you won't be able to have time to collaborate. They will check for cheating, like if your answer is exactly the same as another student's. There won't be enough time for you to Google answers. While it will be open note and open textbook, you're not going to have very much time to look up answers or validate anything. So you should be able to be prepared to answer these questions just using your knowledge and skills that you've been mastering throughout the year. One thing you should be aware of is there will be no calculations on the exam. That means that you won't have to ever calculate a number. But you may need to look at some data sets and interpret numeric information. So here's an example of what that might look like. This is a figure that was on a recent exam. You probably recognize it from some of the air pollution work if you did one of those FRQs. And the question asks, based on the data provided in the graph, identify the national park that has the greatest loss of visibility of 2015 when compared to the historic natural visibility. So here's where you would this is a graphical interpretation. So you're looking at the historic visibility, which are these hashed lines, and then you're comparing that to the 2015 average visibility. And we can see that we would want to identify Sequoia National Park as the park that had the greatest loss of visibility when comparing that historic to that 2015. No calculation. This is all about graphical interpretation. Here's another example of where you would have a graphical interpretation. College Board loves to have double axes graphs. So if we look at this figure, this is showing the atmospheric carbon dioxide at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. We also see that there's the oceanic pH. The carbon dioxide is read off the left-hand side, and the pH is read off the right-hand side. We see two different lines drawn. Determine the concentration of CO2 in parts per million recorded at Mauna Loa in 2005. So we would just go over to 2005, follow that up, and we can see that it's about 375 parts per million. So these are cases where there may be some numbers or numerical interpretation, but you won't have any sort of calculations that you've seen on some other FRQs that we've used in class before. All right, one of the first tips is that unless you're completing a chart or a table, write everything in complete sentences. Now, it's very unlikely that they're going to have some sort of chart or table for you to complete, but let's just go ahead and look at an example of what that might look like in an FRQ. This is a food web question that was on the 2018 exam. So you're just looking at this food web, and then they're asking you to identify a primary producer, identify a primary consumer, and identify a secondary consumer. This is one of the rare instances that I've ever seen that all you have to do is answer one word answer, and you're just interpreting that off of the figure that's above. So identify a primary producer, you would say diatoms. That would be the correct answer. You would not need to elaborate or provide any other further detail. Unless you see a question like this, count on writing a full sentence and having some supportive detail in that sentence. Okay, so let's start talking about identify type questions. Now, identify type questions just require a simple response without elaboration. However, that still usually can't be answered with just a single word. Let's look at an example to see some more detail. This is a prompt that you might remember from the beginning of the year. It was a FRQ that asked about the carbon cycle, and it asked you to identify one terrestrial sink other than fossil fuels that stores carbon for thousands to millions of years. So some students wrote rocks. That is true. There are some kinds of rocks that are very carbon rich, but saying rocks alone isn't enough. You have to say something like sedimentary rocks, or give an example like limestone rocks. Remember, limestone is the accumulation of a lot of organism skeletons, and that would be your carbon sink for thousands to millions of years. Another example might be trees. Yes, trees hold a lot of carbon in them, but remember the prompt asked for thousands to millions of years. These red alders only live about 60 to 70 years maximum, so they wouldn't qualify, but something like your giant sequoia lives 3,000 to 3,500 years. So this would be a carbon sink that would capture carbon and hold it for thousands of years. So you'd have to either say like a specific kind of tree, or you'd have to say something like old growth forests in order to get that point. All right, for the next tip, we just want to re-emphasize that you should organize and label your answers. Now, we've asked you to do this all year long, and I want you to make sure that you're doing this even if you're typing the FRQs or on your final exam. This is an example of an FRQ from a previous exam, and we can see that it's pretty much laid out how you need to format your answer. So remember that just to label each part of your answer, label the answer for A, I, and AII, and then B. Remember to skip a line between each of these different prompts. That's just going to allow you to have some extra room for editing, and it's going to help the reader be able to skim through your answers quickly and give you the points. Finally, cue in onto those bold terms. Remember that those are your task verbs that tell you how much detail you need to have in your supportive answers. They should be bolded on your exam as well. But remember that you can take a look at your sheet in order to remind yourself the quality of the answers that you need to have in each one of those answers. All right, the next tip we're going to look at is knowing the difference between your effects. The first effect you should remember is the environmental effect. So on the bottom left, I've got this graphic with the water cycle. So say that we cut down the trees here, and we're going to alter the water cycle because we're going to reduce our transpiration, and that's going to increase. It's also going to alter the precipitation that might happen on the mountainside or in this rain shadow. What's the environmental effect of deforestation? Well, it could result in increase in mudslides. We no longer have those tree roots there to stabilize the soil, yet that still isn't the environmental effect. The environmental effect might be the increase in turbidity in the coastal waters. That increase in turbidity could smother out aquatic organisms such as corals, or in this case, this is the Big Sur coast, so it could smother out the kelp forest there and impact the food web. The loss of the trees themselves could also result in a loss of habitat. These weaver birds have now lost the habitat that they had to produce their nests, and that is some of the environmental impacts of deforestation. The way I like to remember it is environmental impacts are for nature, by nature. So really don't talk about humans when you're talking about environmental effects. Talk about how this impacts the natural world, either the biotic or the abiotic conditions. Using that same example of the water cycle, let's think about the social and political effects of deforestation. Again, we are using landslides as our example. There could have been loss of life with a landslide such as this scale. We can see that it's covering a road, and there could have been people that were driving on that road. There could have been homes in this area. And so the social impact could be loss of lives, it could be loss of property. The political impact might be that there's no new regulations or policies on where we can build roads or where we can deforest so that we avoid scenarios such as this landslide. Finally, in a scenario such as this, there could be the economic impacts. And make sure when you're talking about economics that you go all the way to talking about the money. So this could be an increase in taxes to build new roads. There could also be an increase in jobs for the construction industry. There could be a loss of money. There could be increase in insurance premiums because people rebuilding in that area have their insurance rates go up. There's a lot of different ways to approach the economic factor, but make sure that you're talking specifically about money or jobs, either increasing or decreasing. There could be negative and positive impacts economically, but just make sure you're going all the way to the money. All right, for the next tip, always look at how many examples were requested in the original prompt and only answer with that number of examples. I know that you have a lot to say in certain areas, but if there's asking for only 2 examples, then give 2 really well explained examples instead of going off topic and potentially losing points. Let's look at a way that that can happen. All right, so let's look at an instance where a person gave too many examples and the first one wasn't correct. This comes from an FRQ last year about piping plover. These are the piping plovers, and these are birds that nest in sandy areas on Assateague Island. And the prompt asked for the person to describe 2 methods that may be used locally to protect coastal communities from rising sea levels. So here the person answers, one way to protect communities from rising sea levels is to drive electric cars so there is less CO2 and less global warming. They then go on to say the city can also plant grass to make sand dunes form, or they can put buildings on stilts so the buildings would be protected from high water. These are all good examples of ways of thinking around how you can protect against rising sea levels. However, the first one doesn't talk directly about rising sea levels and protecting those communities. While you would want to encourage less carbon emissions, that doesn't protect the community. So that point wouldn't count, and that is one answer. That's the first answer, and so they would get no point for that first answer. The next 2 answers are really good and they're correct. However, it's the second and third answer. So they would get point for the second answer, but then their third answer of putting the buildings on stilts wouldn't count. So make sure that you're rereading the prompt. If they're asking for only 2 methods, you're answering with only 2 methods, and that it's directly applicable to the prompt that was asked. Here, just protecting the community from rising sea levels, not preventing sea levels from rising in the first place. Okay, this next tip is just a time saver. Don't restate or rewrite any part of the question. It's a waste of time for you and it's a waste of time for the reader. If you're slow, if you're thinking a lot, if you're slow at writing or slow at typing, you don't want to have any of that 25 minutes or that 15 minutes for those FRQs be tied up with you just reiterating what the prompt is. This is an example that a student submission to that same question that we just talked about on protecting coastal communities. And here I've edited out where they restated the prompt, and that's 3 lines of writing that they could have saved. And that might have made the difference between them getting to the next prompt and answering the question completely, or putting in the details that they need to, versus just putting in kind of fluff or making it seem more readable. Don't worry about the readability. Just be really, really direct. I, as a grader, will know what the question was, and you don't have to repeat any part of that. That's just a time-saving tip. All right, next, pay close attention to the task verbs. I've made a PDF and put it in the bootcamp review. These are the task verbs that you'll be asked about this year, except for the calculate. You'll be asked to describe, explain, identify, justify, make a claim, and propose a solution. So be able to answer these questions. Have this printed off and close to you when you're answering your FRQs. Just in case you forget what justify is or making a claim, you can quickly look at that and you know the quality of the answer that you need to include on your FRQ. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is be really careful with our absolutes. Quite often we want to really emphasize how good or how bad something is, and we will talk about it with a lot of emphasis by saying that it'll kill everything or it'll cure everything. And we want to be realistic in our responses. Let's look at an example of this using the 2017 FRQ about dams and hydroelectricity. This FRQ was talking about dam removal in a part of it, and they were probably thinking about something along the lines of the Elwha River. And so I included a picture here of that dam removal, and you can see the machinery releasing quite a bit more water. The prompt itself asked, when some dams are removed from rivers, describe one negative environmental consequence of removing a dam from a river other than the effects on fish populations. Here are a couple of examples. One student could say there's a tremendous amount of water being released when dams are removed, and that can wipe out all the life downstream. But that's talking with a lot of absolutes, and that rarely happens. This is a really, while there's more water going down, it's a really controlled process, and they're releasing water not all at once, but a little bit at a time. So a better answer is to say when dams are removed, the flow of water is increased. This can wipe out the species that are adapted to calm environments. That way you're specifying what types of organisms are being impacted and how. You're not talking in absolutes that this is going to destroy the whole environment, but you're being clear, you're being concise, and you're telling the reader how knowledgeable you are about the realities of dam removal. All right, the next tip is make sure your answers are legible. Here's where it might be advantageous this year to type your FRQ, especially if you're a fast typer. If you have sloppy handwriting and you don't have the option of typing, then just be really clear in your handwriting, print anything that you can, use blue or black pen, and skip lines. You can always underline or emphasize key words so that things stand out, but just try and slow down and take your time. The readers are really good at deciphering bad handwriting, so if you get in a rush or you get fatigued, don't worry about it. There will be somebody that has your back that's trying to give you the point, and they'll spend a lot of time trying to decipher your handwriting. This next tip goes along with that bad handwriting. Sometimes when we're getting fatigued or when we're thinking a lot, it's just hard to express things in words, and we might want to be able to draw a picture. That is totally allowable, and drawings are acceptable, especially if they're accompanied by a written explanation. This is a FRQ that was on last year's exam, and I graded this at the reading. There's a prompt that asks you to describe 2 environmental consequences other than those related to the loss of boreal forest habitat, the result from the extraction of bitumen, or the transportation of synthetic oil to customers. So I included this picture on the left-hand side just to show you what bitumen extraction looks like. This is a picture of Alberta, Canada, where they're extracting some of the oil sands. We see that nice boreal forest habitat abutted by the extraction. This is a surface strip mining operation. And we want to be able to answer this question. I reconstructed a drawing that I saw on last year's exam. So one of the students was trying to say that too much noise pollution can affect the mating calls and therefore decrease the reproduction in owls. And they drew me this picture of a truck or some sort of vehicle going along a road. You can see that it's really loud, it's vroom vroom, and the owls on either side of the highway or either side of the road aren't able to hear each other in their mating calls, and they even said something like too much noise and birds can't hear mating calls. That clearly defines the environmental consequence, that the decrease in mating opportunities or decrease in reproduction because of the noise pollution that is associated with the transportation of the synthetic oil to its customers. If you are running into problems and you're having a hard time expressing yourself, you can always go to a drawing. Just make sure that you're labeling things and that it is enhancing your answer and not going on the picture alone. Okay, and that leads us to our last tip, which is don't be vague. We're going to spend a couple minutes on this because I want to make sure that you're really not being vague. Now, all year long, you've been learning a lot of detail and you want to be able to express your in-depth knowledge on the FRQ. But this is going to cover all of the topics that we've covered this whole year, so you might find yourself just wanting to answer a question like this pollutes the water, and you forget to back it up with an example. Remember, anytime you write something like that, this pollutes the water, you've got a lot of examples that you've seen this year on specific kinds of pollutants. So it could be polluting the water with endocrine disrupting chemicals that reduce the fertility and reproduction in top predators such as orca whales. It could be polluting the water with toxic pesticides that kill stream insects that are the basis for the aquatic food web. It could be polluting the water with plastics that can entangle and trap wildlife and kill those organisms. So anytime you're saying it's polluting the water or it's polluting this, make sure you're giving me exactly what it's polluting the water with and what that harmful effect could be. Similarly, if you're looking at air pollution, if you're ever finding yourself writing something like it pollutes the air, then back it up with a specific pollutant and the harm that it causes. So it pollutes the air with NOx, which can lead to smog formation or acid deposition. Smog causes severe respiratory problems in people with asthma, and acid deposition can impact seed germination and forest ecosystems. Or it pollutes the air with mercury when coal is burned, which is a neurotoxin, and can lead to brain damage in organisms that bioaccumulate the metal in their bodies. Again, it's a specific pollutant and the harm that's being caused. Similarly, we don't want to be vague when we're talking about the improvements that something can cause. If it's good for the environment, we want to know exactly how it's good for the environment. So for example, you might find yourself talking about renewable energy or wind. This is good for the environment in what specific ways? This decreases carbon emissions from electricity production, which decreases the amount of CO2 that contributes to global warming and climate change. We're talking about specific greenhouse gas here, and that it's related back to climate change. Don't assume that everybody knows that carbon dioxide is related to climate change and global warming. Elaborate that out, state that itself. How else is it good for the environment? It decreases the amount of coal being extracted using mountaintop removal methods that result in stream pollution and habitat fragmentation in communities such as West Virginia. Here we're giving a specific different example. We're decreasing the amount of coal that's being extracted, and we've given an example from a specific place in the United States to support our in-depth knowledge. Finally, we could say something like it decreases the amount of natural gas being transported by rail and the likelihood of a train exploding. If you haven't heard of that, I included a link where you can find out more information about how transporting natural gas can be really harmful to communities and affect people along those transportation routes. Okay, my very last tip I can't put on paper, and that's that you are a skilled, knowledgeable, and confident person. You've been studying for this test the whole year. I've held you to really high expectations, and you've risen up to meet them, and I know you're going to be awesome. Just remember, right before the exam, to inhale confidence and exhale your doubt. You're going to do great.